So that's a different way of thinking about your practice. If you are thinking, wow, okay, I've got about another 13 years to really start to feel good about this stuff. And the other thing I would say about that, just in the broad general terms about getting better, is that it requires self-knowledge. Because what you have to do is you have to start looking at how you learn. You have to start looking at your own pace, how quickly things develop for you. You know, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And you start to cultivate your own practice path through knowledge of that. And I think, you know, I was very much that way. You know, I wanted to be the person who was like a methodical, you know, every day, just gonna crack it, you know, just get on it and work very consistently in small measured chunks. That's the kind of person I wanted to be. The kind of person that I actually am by nature is a sort of burst of energy until I collapse. That's how I work. So over the course of my life, I've been trying to train myself to be the person, to be the tortoise. Every day, 10 minutes. Every day, 10 minutes. That's been, and it's still not my nature. I mean, I've been able to develop that habit, but I'm still more comfortable with, and most of my greatest successes come in projects that allow me to be my natural self, which is busted 24/7 as hard as I can until I collapse, and hope that I've gotten far enough to make something work. So I've had to accept that about myself. As much as I admire people like Dan Ballmer, who can just say, man, half an hour a day, half an hour a day, every single day. I mean, I'm not that person. And so the idea of self-knowledge in your practice is a continual sort of, I mean, I'm trying to improve myself, I'm trying to work on my weaknesses, but I'm also honest about my strengths and accepting of who I am as a person. And so for you guys who are younger, it's about finding out who you are as a person. How do I work best? Am I a morning person? Do I need to figure out how I can get up at 6 to shed, because that's when I really have the most alertness? Am I an evening person and I need to just like get my day job out of the way or get something done, you know, take care of my business to allow myself from 8 to midnight or 10 to 2 because that's my productive time and I need to set up my life that way? I mean, you guys are in that exploratory phase. So. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So that's sort of like this idea of you know, broadly. So now a little bit about some specific thoughts about what to practice. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we, as musicians, do a physical activity. I mean, we don't necessarily, we think about ourselves as playing music, but what is actually playing music? You know, I mean, it involves fine motor skills. It involves gross motor skills, it involves concentration, memorization, all these kind of things. And so one of the things I've been thinking about lately a lot is comparing musicians to athletes. I've been trying to think about, you know, and the Olympics is a perfect time to think about that, because when you think about athletes, you think about professional sports, you think about millionaires and people who are really highly paid, generally. But the Olympics is not like that. I mean, the shot put guy, every 4 years he has one shot at getting his name in the paper. He's shedding the shot put for his whole life, right? He's not going to get rich. He's not even going to make any money at it. That seems like a great comparison to what a jazz musician does. He does it, but I mean, they have to do it for the love of it, right? They have to be completely, they're not going to be stars. They're not going to be famous. They're not, I mean, they get this one shot at the prize, and yet, and so what they do is they dedicate themselves to sort of mastery and a total understanding of what they do. I mean, if you're a shot putter, you study the history of your sport. You know every single person who did it, and you know how they did it, right? You study their physical, you study how they trained, how they ate, you study how they executed every single one of their movements. I mean, you know, sprinters, same way, right? I mean, it's like, they do like slow motion, high speed photography of their starts. So they study the twitch muscle fibers, I mean, and so they're really serious, right? It's not for money, it's not for, I mean, it's just, because that's what mastery means. And I like that idea for us as musicians to not just think about the music, which we do, but also think about this as a physical activity. If you play the bass, well, so here's an example, right? Okay, think for a minute about the instrument you play, and then think about the physical activity, like a sport or some physical activity that you think, athletic activity, that's closest to the instrument that you play, that makes the same demands on your body that playing the instrument that you play. If you're a drummer, if you're a bass player, if you're a trumpet player, think about that for a second, and then give me some thoughts about
weightlifting.
Okay, so you're the bass player. You're the bass player. You say weightlifting.
Weightlifting.
Okay. Why? What?
Because I have to be able to just physically manage the beast, you know.
Okay.
Even in the smaller movements.
Okay. Yeah.
I think of a bass player as like a long distance runner.
Okay. Cool. How so?
There's no stopping. Or if you do stop, you pass it off to someone so they can take care of the group that you're with. You're running in a team.
Like a relay thing. But so okay, so that for you it's strength, right? So where? Balance, strength here,
Yeah.
strength in your quads, right? Strength in your back, right? So how many of you bass players train strength? How many of you sort of do squats, lift, like work on the neck, alignment of the head, right? What about other instruments? What other activities do you think reflecting what you do? Yeah.
Think of drums as being sort of like a quarterback or point guard.
Okay. So what are the skills, the physical skills inherent?
Oh, you're not just the physical.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking about.
Okay, I was thinking more in other ways than physical, but well, it is a physical instrument as far as you're moving. You can go fast, and also you're moving further away from the instrument than most other instruments.
Well, yeah. Okay.
I would think of the drums more as like alignment, because you have to use more limbs.
So in terms of like upper body strength?
And lower body strength.
And lower body strength. So support, yeah, which is interesting. How many drummers have actually thought about, I know you're using your legs, but how many drummers have actually thought about strengthening your core in order to be able to play? You look at Tony Williams, right? And that cat had, there's only one way he was able to be that explosive, is having core strength. The same kind of core strength that you would need to lift, to lift weights. So, yeah.
I'll just another example, I guess, for a guitar player, like wrist with motion, so like maybe frisbee or like throwing a baseball.
Okay, all right. So pitcher, baseball pitcher, that's a good, okay. So what I would ask you to,
just with violin, it reminds me of when I play water polo, because it's just like keeping this position, and so I'm playing polo once I'm treading, I'm constantly just like this waiting for a ball or shooting it, and I never have rest.
Right, so
like
shoulders
my shoulder,
strength.
yeah,
Right,
so
right.
on my shoulders and my back.
So one of the things I would ask you to do is I would ask you to consider your instrument approaching your practice and adding a physical component to it that is physical training. That's just sort of something that you will do to work on striving towards mastery, but basically just in that physical area. Something to think about. And that's something I think about, and I play a lot of tennis. And so watching how tennis players develop has gotten me thinking about how musicians develop and wondering why don't we do, tennis players do footwork drills for hours. They don't have a racket, they just do footwork drills. What do we do away from our instruments to train our bodies? Because I see so many freshman guitar players who come here and they're practicing for the first time maybe 4 or 5 hours longer per day than they ever have in their lives, and they haven't stretched. They know nothing about tendons, they know nothing about muscles, and they get hurt. Within 6 months, they get hurt and they can't play. So I'm thinking we need to, as musicians, I think we need to start thinking about what we do as a physical activity and work with that. Second thing I want to talk about is this idea of deliberate practice. There was a book that came out, Alan Jones turned me on to it, and it's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And it's a fantastic book. The guy's name is Anders Ericsson. No, that's not true. That's not true. He's quoting there. I'll give you a link to it on the blog. But the book is all about memory, and it's this guy who learns to train for the U.S. Memory Championships. Right. But he talks about how we learn, and fascinating book. And one of the things that he talks about is these studies on memorization and on practicing and skill acquisition. So I want to read a little bit of it, a quote from this book and this idea about deliberate practicing and skill acquisition, and then talk a little bit about that. Take some questions. So I have to skim this, but so Anders Ericsson has studied the process of skill acquisition from dozens of different angles in almost as many different fields. What I already knew, so this is the author speaking, what I already knew from talking with him extensively and from reading almost every book and paper he's written was that in domain after domain, he found a common set of techniques that the most accomplished individuals tend to employ in the process of becoming an expert. So they're general principles of expertise acquisition. In the 1960s, the psychologists Fitz and Posner described the 3 phases that everyone goes through in acquiring a new skill. During the first phase, known as the cognitive stage, you're intellectualizing the task and discovering new strategies to accomplish it more proficiently. So I would say that that's where many of us are when we first start jazz. We're in this sort of cognitive stage, trying to discover new strategies. During the second, associative stage, you're concentrating less, making fewer major errors, and generally becoming more efficient. And finally, you reach what Fitz calls the autonomous stage, when you figure that you've gotten as good as you need to get at the task, and you're basically running on autopilot. During that autonomous stage, you lose conscious control over what you're doing. Most of the time, that's a good thing. Your mind has one less thing to worry about. In fact, the autonomous stage seems to be one of those handy features that evolution worked out for our benefit. The less you have to focus on the repetitive tasks of everyday life, the more you can concentrate on the stuff that really matters, the stuff that you haven't seen before. And so, once we're just good enough at typing, we move it to the back of our mind's filing cabinet and stop paying it any attention. You can actually see the shift take place in MRI scans of people learning new skills. As a task becomes automated, other parts of the brain take over. You could call it the OK plateau, the point at which you decide you're okay with how good you are at something, turn on autopilot, and stop improving. And I think that a lot of us sort of are in that place that we slide into that. Yeah.
What was number 2, the name for it?
Number 2 was the associative stage, where you're concentrating less. And again, I'll have this whole thing on the blog so you can read it as well. We all reach OK plateaus in most things that we do. We learn how to drive when we're in our teens, and once we're good enough to avoid tickets and major accidents, we only get incrementally better. Psychologists used to think that OK plateaus mark the upper bounds of innate ability. Let's see. Francis Galton used to argue that that people could only improve at physical and mental activities up until they reached a certain wall, which they cannot by education or exertion overpass. So it's nice to know that this is a myth, because a lot of people think that, well, you've reached the limit of your innate talent, you won't get better. No matter what you do, you won't get better. And he's saying that this is something that now they have more information on. Erickson and his fellow expert performance psychologists have found over and over again that with the right kind of concerted effort, that is rarely the case. They believe that Galton's wall often has much less to do with our innate limits than simply with what we consider an acceptable level of performance. What separates experts from the rest of us is that they tend to engage in a very directed, highly focused routine, which Erickson has labeled deliberate practice. Having studied the best of the best in many different fields, he has found that top achievers tend to follow the same general pattern of development. They develop strategies for consciously keeping out of the autonomous stage while they practice by doing three things: focusing on their technique, staying goal-oriented, and getting constant and immediate feedback on their performance. In other words, they force themselves to stay in the cognitive stage. Amateur musicians, for example, are more likely to spend their practice time playing music, whereas pros are more likely to work through tedious exercises or focus on specific, difficult parts of pieces. The best ice skaters spend more of their practice time trying jumps that they land less often, while lesser skaters work more on the jumps they've already mastered. Deliberate practice by its nature must be hard. When you want to get good at something, how you spend your time practicing is far more important than the amount of time you spend. I should read that again. When you want to get good at something, how you spend your time practicing is far more important than the amount of time you spend. In fact, in every domain of expertise that's been rigorously examined, from chess to violin to basketball, studies have found that the number of years one has been doing something correlates only weakly with level of performance. Unless you're consciously challenging yourself and monitoring your performance, reviewing, responding, rethinking, rejiggering, it's never going to make you appreciably better. Regular practice simply isn't enough. To improve, we must watch ourselves fail and learn from our mistakes. The best way to get out of the autonomous stage and off the OK plateau, Erickson has found, is to actually practice failing. One way to do that is to put yourself in the mind of someone far more competent at the task you're trying to master and try to figure out how that person works through problems. So I would stop here and say that that sort of ties in really nicely with what George was saying about this listening. I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the morning shed tomorrow, but a lot of ways that we can listen. And one of the things that I like to do when I listen is to try and figure out how that person solved the problems that arise from what they're playing. And so I try and put myself in the mind of Joe Henderson. So what is he thinking? And more often than not, I ask him, what did he practice? To get that, what did he practice? To do that, what did he practice? And so I'm constantly speculating and trying things to figure out what did he practice to get that, because I'll practice that. And so my practice notebook is full of these little sort of ideas about what somebody else may have practiced. And every time I listen, I try and sort of see, okay, what from what I know now, what did I see, what do I hear, what do I know that I could practice that would allow me to do that and constantly expand that. Let's see. The best chess players follow a similar strategy. They will often spend several hours a day replaying the games of grandmasters one move at a time, trying to understand the expert's thinking at any step. Indeed, the single best predictor of an individual's chess skill is not the amount of chess he's played against opponents, but rather the amount of time he spent sitting alone working through old games. So I think you can sort of substitute music for chess. You can substitute transcriptions for old games or recordings. And this idea that, and George was talking about this, that you don't, well, a little tangent. So most everybody here was born and raised in America or in Canada, let's say. And I think that one of the things that we, sort of this idea of self-awareness, is that we need to somehow begin over the course of our lives to become aware of our environment as it affects us. It's kind of like fish don't know they're in water. They think that's the world, right? We're outside of it, we see it's water. We don't know, we sort of think that the way we experience things is the way that things are. But it's just our experience. So growing up in America or in the United States or in Canada, we have this culture of individualism, which says that, and I've had this argument on and off the bandstand with Dan Ballmer, long and deep conversations about this for many years. So our Western culture says that the freedom of the individual is more important than the benefit of the community, right? I mean, we see this played out in every aspect of life, from taxes to education to, but it plays out in our musical lives too. It plays out in our approach. So one of the things that this means is that in America, when we grow up here with this idea of individualism, we sort of balk at the idea of imitation. We think we're supposed to make it up ourselves, and we're supposed to have, that it's more important that we have our own individual form of expression than sort of follow a well-trod path. And what we don't realize is that that's because we grew up here. Now, if you grow up in another culture, say Asian cultures, Japanese culture, Chinese culture, that culture is based in a very different, I mean, it's changing, but it's based in a different premise. Their premise is that the success of the group is way the hell more important than anything you get as an individual. And so harmony of the group and thriving of the community is the most important thing. And so I think growing up as a learner in that culture, imitation is not shunned, because you're following in the footsteps that are proven by the group, right? And so I think that in jazz, it's so interesting because the way that we teach it is very much in this sort of communal tradition. Jazz came up in a community tradition, right? Elders taught younger musicians. There was sort of this gateway that the older musicians were the gatekeepers of the culture, and they were the ones that were supposed to make sure that you knew what you needed to know, and until you had their approval, you couldn't. So in talking to older musicians, the way they learned the music over, in the 50s and the 40s and times before that, there was nothing wrong with imitation. You just you did what everybody else did, and eventually you got your own thing going. I mean, you always, and they knew you would. It would be fine, but. So I think that that's just something that's interesting. And so when I read this about the chess people, and I say that to students here, I know that a lot of them sort of bristle at that. It's like, well, I want to be myself. I don't want to be Joshua Redman. I don't want to be McCoy Tyner. I want to be myself. And I always tend to say that in this particular art form, the sort of most assured or the most well-trod path to mastery is one that goes through imitation and understanding of other people and comes out the other side. Like nobody's gonna let you stay in that imitative phase. You will have to break out of it eventually, but coming through it is is important. So I'm going to leave the rest of this for now, and again, this will be on the blog, and you can. So deliberate practice. So I think that's just something as something that I think you can think about in terms of your practice. Is like, how can I stay out of the okay plateau? Where have I hit it? Where do I say, well, this is just I'm just okay? And the thing is, the more that you question that, the more interesting playing your instrument is going to be. The more you go, well, you know what? This note is always out of tune, I've noticed. That's no longer okay. Now, what do I do? How do I fix that? All of a sudden, you're engaged in a way that you weren't when this stuff was just like, it plays the same way all the time, it's out of tune. I said that because this is never out of tune. Okay. Couple things. There's a strategy that I like to, I'll go back to sort of the ideas around how we practice. One of the things I think that's really important is figuring out the tools that you need. And I know this is really, it's funny. Everybody knows this. Actually, you say this like, what do you need? You need a metronome, you need a pencil, you need a notebook, you need something to record yourself. How many people do it? How many people every single time they practice have a space that is completely outfitted, like when somebody goes to work, like when a lineman goes to fix a repair line, right? You think he checks his tool belt and makes sure every tool is in there and makes sure that the safety strap works before he goes up, right? Because he's not going to climb down to get the thing that, right? How many people do that in their practice? Every day, same space that they've set up that's designed that has all their stuff in it, right? All right.
But I don't necessarily use everything.
No, but it's there.
Yeah,
but it's there. You've set up this environment. So I would challenge each of you to commit to that. I would say that is so conducive. I mean, not having that creates a hardship that is completely within your control to eradicate, right? I mean, everybody can figure that out. It's like, where's my metronome and are there batteries? Where's the pencil and let me sharpen it? I know that it's good to record myself. Is my recorder right by my music stand charged and ready to go? Computer recorder, right? So that's one of the things, sort of having these tools and having this environment. And why make it harder on yourself when you can make it easier on yourself? And I think that's something that also will enhance your sense of commitment to yourself. The fact that I've done this for myself, I know it's set up. Practice notebook. Get a practice notebook to log your activities, your ideas, the things you're working on, a schedule, and notes. So one of the things that I do with my piano class at the beginning of the term is I give them an assignment. A lot of people here have taken my piano class. And I ask them to estimate how long it'll take them to complete the assignment. I say, okay, you're going to learn, these 5 scales, or you're going to learn the Dorian mode up to the 9th, right hand, left hand, hands separately in 12 keys. How long do you think, Carrie, how long do you think it'll take you to do that? Jesse, how long do you think you'll do that? And I think that when we practice, a lot of times we have this sort of, this training sequence idea that we never actually, it's like dieting, I'm going to lose 25 pounds. But we never actually think about how, step by step, we're actually going to lose. What am I not going to eat today? What am I not going to eat tomorrow? And so that, the practice notebook is the place where you sort of keep all your information about practicing, including like, okay, my goal for tomorrow, for this week is this. Now, I think it'll take me 4 hours. When am I going to do the 4 hours? 20 minutes this morning, 20 minutes now, 20 minutes. How many people have done that? Have sort of made a practice schedule, like a notebook and a schedule of when, and sort of set a time frame. Because what happens is at the end of that, you can look and say, wow, I thought it was going to take me 2 hours. It took me 20 minutes. That's really valuable information, right, for setting up your practice. Or the reverse. I thought it was going to take me half an hour. Man, dude, it took me 6 hours. That's really valuable information for setting up your life. Because if you want to get better at something, you need that knowledge. You need to know. And to estimate your next week, you need to know that's like, okay, well, I did this in 20 minutes this week, so, and having that stuff written down, again, it's like having this committed space to practice. It makes it a lot easier than trying to remember, how long did it take me to do that? Did I get it? I don't know, I can't remember. Starting over every single week. Question?
No.
And then just sort of an idea to throw in there around this idea of deliberate practicing. One of the things that I would encourage you to experiment with is this experiment. I mean, I know that he just said in deliberate practicing is learning to practice failing. But on another way to think about this is practicing with zero tolerance for mistakes. So one of the things I've tried to do this from time to time, and I mean, I wish I had the discipline to do it more, so I'm trying to develop the discipline to do it more, is to see if I can learn a piece or a passage without ever making a mistake at it, right? Without ever introducing, it's like introducing no foreign matter whatsoever into the processing of this. I've done it with one thing. There was a really, really tough passage of some Esperanza music, and I was like, okay, let me see if I use this, if I never ever fail, I won't know how to. I won't know how to screw it up because I never ever ever did it. So what that process means is it means a lot less playing. It means a lot less sort of more examining, thinking. It's completely by its nature 100% deliberate, because you look at a passage of music, you look at a 2-bar lick or something like that, and you go, okay, how much of this can I play and not make a mistake? How slowly do I need to do this and not make a mistake? And artificially, for your own edification only, you're introducing this sort of level of focus into your practicing that says, I refuse to concentrate any less. I mean, I refuse to not concentrate. I refuse to touch this particular piece of musical passage in a state of anything less than total concentration. Now, what could be more fun? What could be more engaging than giving yourself that challenge, right? It's just like, okay, and then you may fail, but I guarantee that you will introduce so many fewer mistakes than you generally do. And let's see how this goes. It doesn't go anything like that, right? So what I should have done was done that approach to Scott Hall's, the last 4 bars of Scott Hall's piece on the which it was too late. I'd already introduced too many mistakes into it by the time I tried to learn it right. So anyway, that's just an idea. This idea of zero tolerance for mistakes is an exercise. Yeah.
So how do you go practice failing and then practice not failing at all? How do those work together?
Well, okay. When I think of practice, when I hear somebody say practice failing, what that means to me is that means to take my attention away from the things that I do well, and be willing to concentrate all my attention on the things I can't do well. So that, to me, the idea of practice failing is a broad guideline. Being willing to practice, being willing to fail, right? So this strategy of zero tolerance for mistakes, you can't live that way. You can't practice all that way. You don't have the. I mean, I don't know who could. I don't. Maybe Bruce Lee. Maybe somebody, some really, really focused martial artist. I think that's something that you can aspire for. That's a technique. That's an exercise that you might work on towards something. And if you find it useful, continue to build on it. But it's an ideal, right? It's not. But this idea of practicing failing, to me, that's a directive that says, look at, sort of shift your focus to the things that you really are. And it's cool. I mean, if I asked you, we'll do this in the combo or something. I'll ask you we'll play the tune, and I'll ask you, okay, where are the hard points? Where are the parts that you know in your body and your mind right now you're going to screw them up? You don't even have your instrument in your hand, but you can feel that you can't feel how to do it right. Would be interesting to start your, 5? Oh.
No, I was just going to say that, I think what you're talking about in terms of, practicing failing, it's almost like, or perfect practice, it's like you end up practicing things in a way where it doesn't sound like music. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it's something it's under construction. It's like I used to practice inventions, the Bach inventions, and I practiced them so slowly. And it's kind of like what you're talking about, where I didn't want to introduce mistakes. I mean, and it happens, whatever, but you practice it so slowly, it just sounds, and it's not fun. But you're kind of laying the groundwork, you're laying a foundation. And that is why it takes discipline, because it doesn't sound like anything. It doesn't sound like music. There's no pleasure in it, really. It's almost like the way athletes do, exercises, and they don't do them necessarily because the fun is when you're in the race or you're in the game, but everything else, the preparation, isn't fun, and so it's like you're laying that foundational groundwork, right? And so I hope I'm not. Did you already cover?
No, no, good.
But I think that's sort of related to what he was asking. It's like when I would play these inventions so slowly, like my family would get upset.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's a lot of your practice is not meant for anyone's consumption, even your own. You can't even listen to it, but you have to do it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Can I, if you don't mind, I'm going to just finish up the whole question. I will.
Well, it was more of a comment to kind of.
Let's come back to it, if you don't mind. Okay, so a couple more general things about what we practice and how we practice. Something that's really important to me, and I think George has alluded to that too, is the idea of breaking down tasks into small, manageable things. So you could use that in conjunction with this sort of zero tolerance for mistakes, or you could just, I think it's just a good thing to do anyway. Developing the ability to take something larger, take a large problem, and break it into small, solvable components. So as a drummer, I mean, it's very easy, right? You got a groove. First you practice the right foot, then you practice the left foot by itself, then you practice the left hand by itself, then you practice the right hand by itself. I mean, it's just like you break, and then you learn all those things, and then you put them together, and you practice two things together, you practice three things together. Same thing. I mean, we all do that, but I like to look at everything. If I'm trying to learn a Herbie solo, I want to break that down. A 12-chorus Herbie solo on one finger snap. I want to break that down into small, manageable components, and I want to put that, sort of. Again, I'll try to forecast how long, because my time is limited, and because I don't want to be discouraged, I will try and estimate how long it'll take me. And then I take each of those small tests and I estimate how long each of those are going to take me, because it allows me to sort of to feel like I'm staying on track to make it there. So one of the ways that I do this is sort of trying to figure out determine a tempo that I can work on something without making any mistakes. And then I look for problems, George was saying this too, look for problems and challenges in your practicing, and when you find them, stop and identify strategies for addressing them. So that's one of my favorite things to do about practice, is to sort of look through a piece of music and go, okay, where's the part that I'm going to suck? I mean, where's the part that I'm totally going to blow? It's like, oh, those, yeah, in Erigen, it's like, oh, the 2-5-1 going to B. I know right now that I don't have that vocabulary. So let me just, Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, it's 2-5-1 in B, right? I'm going right for the very difficult thing. And I'll break that down. Work on the 2 chord for a while. What do I play on that? Work on the 5 chord. So all these things that George put on your sheet about how to practice, sort of, you can add to that by sort of looking for your own sort of particular challenges and problems. Related to that is sort of figuring out where the problems lie. I like to break down my practice into 3 ways of learning. One is sort of tactile, sort of muscle memory. So I'm practicing to sort of train my muscles to do something. Ear practice. So I'm practicing to hear things better. And then mental or intellectual practice. So I'm really practicing to know things. So if I have a particular musical problem, one of the things I'll do is try and figure out what aspect is breaking down. Is it my ear? I can't hear the change. I don't know, so I'll work on that. Is it my mind is breaking down? I can't remember the chord change. I can't intellectually, I can't remember the chord scale. So how will I work on that? I might work on that through singing. I might work on that through flashcards. I might work on that through transcribing. I might work on that through writing out the chord changes, or writing out an arpeggio, or composing a solo, right? And then what's breaking down, is it the physical, the muscle stuff that's breaking down. So then I take, small, slow, deliberate practice, metronome, scaling up from, through the beat. So again, I think the common thing the theme that I'm saying here is really trying to use your mind and your sort of thinking process to figure out what to do, as opposed to just playing. I mean, there's definitely a time for just playing, and that's fantastic. But practice, which in my mind equates to training, it's like if if I'm Rafa Nadal, I'm not going out to hit tennis balls. I'm going out to train. And when I train, I do this, and I do this, and I do this. And then I have lots of fun. I hit tennis balls for fun. I do all this stuff. But my training is my training, and every day I train. And so that's sort of thinking about practicing that way for me has made it a lot more, has made me able to get, I feel like, get a lot more out of the time that I have. So I'm going to take 5 more minutes and just talk about a couple of things. So one of the other things that I think that we can practice, and George was talking about this in his last thing about how some people have really good time, but they don't have a good feel. And so one of the things I think we need to practice is we need to practice expressing emotion in our playing. So it's kind of like the opposite of what George was saying about practicing the Bach, the Bach inventions at a completely non-musical thing, right? I feel like we, as improvisers, we practice to gain facility on instruments, and we sort of practice to assimilate vocabulary. And but I think that we also need to practice learning to express and portray emotions. And so a couple of things that I do, or suggest that my students do with that, are just trying to think about you're practicing like you're an actor, or you're playing like you're an actor. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll listen to Wynton Kelly play on on Green Belt Street or Freddie Freeloader, right? And then I'm going to try and just get into the persona of Wynton Kelly. Now, in the age of YouTube, it's so much better. When I was a kid, I just had to imagine. I'd never seen Wynton Kelly. I know nothing but the photograph. Now I can actually watch him play. It's like, dude, he does that. Look at that technique. Wow.